All right, folks, good evening. Why don't we get started? I think we're about right on time, and if folks come in, that'll be great as well. So first of all, thank you very much for coming this evening, spending your evening as we look over a draft memorandum of understanding that we'll be getting into this evening. But first I want to introduce myself. I'm Damon Connolly, Marin County Supervisor for District 1, which includes Santa Venetia, which I'm very proud to represent, I always have to add. I'm going to stand a little bit on formality and start the proceedings up here with a microphone because we're being taped. Thank you, John, for doing that. And I also want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay. Okay, about the right volume. That having been said, we do have the ability to take the mic off and hear from you as well. The purpose of this evening is to get public comment. We are also soliciting written comments on what I'll call the MOU, rather than continuing to say Memorandum of Understanding, by December 11th. And then ultimately, if we decide to go forward with this, it would come before the Board of Supervisors, and there would be another opportunity, if not more, for public comment as well. A couple other quick introductions before we go forward. Perhaps needing no introduction, my aide, Susanna Clark, who many of you know and have worked with. Susanna has been very involved in this and other community issues for Santa Venetia. We have Chief Assistant Director of County Public Works, Craig Tackaberry. Good evening, Craig. Craig is going to be going through the nuts and bolts of the MOU and really lay that out for you. We have Associate Civil Engineer Hannah Lee here. Hannah, all right. You might want to come up front at some point as well and join in. I'd like to recognize some community members that have really stepped up and served our community, and their roles are also germane to our evaluation of this. This evening is not a formal meeting of Flood Zone 7 or CSA 6. Nevertheless, we're thankful that many of the members are here to help with the discussion. So I'd like to acknowledge from Flood Zone 7, Jeff Krepnick, Jackie Garcia, Roger Kirk, one of our newest members, and Russ Greenfield. And then from CSA 6, we have Ellen Stein, now also on CSA 18, so looking forward to that, and Ken King. Hey, Ken. Am I missing anyone from CSA 6 or any other community boards? Again, thank you for that. So really the point tonight is to get your feedback as, in effect, I and staff make a decision on whether it's in the best interests of the community and the county and all taxpayers to enter an MOU with the airport. I don't need to tell you that the history between the community and airport has been marked by uncertainty, conflict, and contention. And we'll go over a little bit of the history tonight, but really the whole point of me undertaking this endeavor with you is that how can we move forward in a constructive way? Put a lot of issues behind us, resolve uncertainties, and hopefully achieve a win-win situation. So it really came to a head for me a couple years ago in the most recent example of when there was an emergency repair on a portion of the levee out at the airport that is on state tidelands. And historically, those have been county-controlled lands. Now, some may dispute that, and I'm sure we may hear that. But for all intents and purposes, as a new supervisor, I made the decision with staff that it was incumbent on us to work with the airport to fund a repair and therefore avoid liability to taxpayers. That outlay was for $200,000. That's a significant piece of change. The good news, in a sense, as we'll hear, is that the actual repair was more about $21,000 to date, but theoretically that item is still open. So I want to talk briefly about really the three specific goals of the MOU, levee repair being one of them. Through the years, boundary uncertainty along Galenas Creek has been an issue for the Santa Venetia community, as well as for the county. Issues related to the maintenance of flood protection on properties, namely levees, along both banks of Galenas Creek have been raised repeatedly. And the lack of clarity as to who is responsible for what has been a reoccurring theme. And depending on who you ask and which map they have from which century, as well as which documents, you may very well get a different answer on that. So the lack of clarity is really an issue. I've heard the comments and complaints, and by the way, a lot of community input has already led to what is in the draft. Some of you may recognize some of the issues, and thank you for your participation today. And believe it is time to address these uncertainties and inconsistencies once and for all. The MOU is an effort to resolve the issues and create certainty going forward. So one of the issues I've heard loud and clear about is that there is uncertainty regarding the title to many residents' land and obstacles in maintaining their docks. There's even been litigation between at least two property owners and the airport about who owns the dock in their backyard. And this is on the south side of the South Fork of the creek. Specifically for and I think we have a knowledgeable audience by the looks of it, but we can go into greater detail as needed about the specific areas along Vendola Drive where that's an issue. Under the MOU, the county will pay for the State Lands Commission to redraw the maps along the South Fork of Galenas Creek to exchange the title to the land under and on the south bank of the Galenas Creek into the backyards of those properties along Vendola Drive. The State Lands Commission maps will clearly reflect that the owners of the San Rafael Airport will have no legal interest in the land on the south bank of Galenas Creek along Vendola. Under the new maps that will be issued by state lands, because all this has to go up to the State Lands Commission anytime you're dealing with these kind of boundaries. We envision that the county will then quitclaim its rights to the property owners. This will eliminate any potential cloud on the title for those property owners where the airport has asserted property rights. In other words, in our view, it's going to clear up title in a way that makes it way more clear and easy to understand in terms of those property owners using and maintaining their docks and also maintenance of those levees on that side of the creek. I've heard from the community that you don't want county taxpayer dollars going to improve or repair levees on the airport property. And by the way, I'm well aware of the history with the airport. Some of you may recall, I was on the San Rafael City Council during the whole airport soccer complex chapter, if you will. I voted against that project. I was the only person on the city council that did so it passed. I had a lot of environmental concerns with it, and believe me, I heard loud and clear from the community. What I would offer to you this evening is perhaps we always need to be aware of history, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. We are not relitigating approval of the airport soccer complex. It's really limited to the three issues at hand. So, that having been said, I'm always cognizant of trying to understand your concerns and avoid expending taxpayer money where possible. And again, it came to a head with the $200,000 outlay. People question, why is the county responsible for those levies in the first place? The community has suggested that rather than continue to repair the levees on state tidelands, why not just give the levees to the airport? Well, that sounded like a pretty good solution to me, and that's what we're doing in this MOU. As I mentioned, in July of 2015, a breach in the levee surrounding the airport was reported. After analysis, it was determined that the breach occurred on levees that are on land granted to the county under the state tideland statutes, a copy of which we have, therefore owned by the county in trust. Given the provisions of the statutes, the county determined that it was responsible for maintaining that levee, and again, this was an emergency repair, or risk claims for liability and damages from the airport and other properties upland if any failure in that levee caused flooding. As you recall, we have a mobile home park back there, et cetera. So the county authorized the spending of $200,000 for one-time repair. This MOU makes the airport responsible for the levees on their side of the creek and removes the county from any liability. The county will exchange its tidelands on the airport side with the airport's asserted rights to any properties on the Vendola side of the creek. That's the nature of the land exchange at issue. Finally, and thirdly, I've heard from the community that they don't want the airport to be given anything, including the tip of the airport property. And for those who are not totally familiar with that plot of land, we'll be hearing about that. The tip of the airport property is also land granted by the state tideland statutes to the county in trust. The MOU provides for the tip to remain the property of the county. Currently, there is a levee in place around the tip that protects the airport. The county will pursue outside grant funds to pay for moving the levee inland to allow for restoration of the tip to marshland, another goal I've heard that the community wants to pursue. When the funds for that restoration are secured, the levee will be moved back toward the airport to allow for restoration of the tip. The relocated levee will become the new property line and will be reflected by the state tidelands map, again, part of what will be resolved at the State Lands Commission. Until the money is secured and the levee is moved, the tip will remain county land, but the county will lease the current levee to the airport so that the airport has all responsibility for maintaining and repairing those levees. The State Lands Commission survey and mapping process is expected to take 3 years, is what we're being told. The intent of the MOU is a 10-year agreement stating that the airport is solely responsible for what lies on the north bank of Galenas Creek and releasing the county from any responsibility. So in sum, and again, very much looking forward to a robust discussion tonight, and we even have some boards up that we're going to write down all your comments. I believe that this agreement is a win-win for the county, the community, the property owners on both sides of the creek. We have a statement in black and white, namely the MOU, to be confirmed by an updated State Lands Commission map, creating certainty. No more competing maps, albeit very interesting to know someone's interpretation of what happened in 1872. He said, she said statements of who is responsible for what, or historical references that conflict with current policy decision. We all will be released from all of this and have a clean record going forward. I hope you will at least agree with me that's worthy of consideration. So thank you. So we don't really have a formal agenda. Thank you for paying attention to me. Might have gone on a little bit too long. We're now going to hear from Mr. Tackaberry with more details, and then we're going to open it up to public discussion. We ask that we're not going to really put a time limit at first, but we have a good-sized group. I know there's very knowledgeable people in the room. We want to hear from everyone, so we might either informally have to say, let's try to do 3 minutes, or we may have to get to that point ultimately. Again, a little bit of history good, but also I'm very interested in how we move forward as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Damon. What am I doing wrong here? Somehow it's weird. So again, I'm Craig Tackaberry, Chief Assistant Director. I'm going to come over here so I can operate the computer. So this, I took just things right off the website, so this isn't new information. If you've looked at the information, it's not stuff you haven't seen before. But as Damon said, this is off the website. The 3 main purposes was to resolve conflicting boundary information, address long-term maintenance of the levees, and to plan for future restoration of the land east of the runway. And since we sent out the notices, we got some feedback that people wanted more time, so we've extended the comment period 2 more weeks, so now it's December 11th. If you want to provide some written comments, and there's an email address to send the comments in. And we've also committed that we're not going to bring the MOU to the board before early 2018, so it's not going to happen this calendar year. There was some concern about that. So the MOU starts with, it's an agreement between the county and the airport, the 2 parties, and it starts with a few whereases. The first whereas talks about the land that Damon explained that the county holds, the state tied lands, and it was a statute of 1975. There's a lot of other statutes, a lot of information. We thought this one was probably the most relevant, so we kind of used that as a basis for the MOU. The second whereas covers airport-owned property. They have a lot of different assessor parcel numbers, and they're all listed there. And then we kind of have a basis. The levees are subject to erosion and settlement, and that we want to work together to address that, that we have levees on our property, and that their deed boundary extends through the creek over to some areas on Manila Drive, and that we think it's our best interest to partner together to address these issues. And so then we get into the specifics. The first one says that the airport's going to prepare plans and conduct the repair. And so one of the things that this MOU provides is, the airport's willing to sign this now. We've spent a long time talking about details, and they are willing to do this. So this is come to you for comment, and they accept the terms as written. So if we get comments and want to change the terms, then we have to go back to them and discuss it again. But right now, they're willing to sign it as it's currently proposed. And then they're going to, the second agreement requirements, they're going to get all required permits from County Public Works. They just received a permit. Some work is underway. Maybe it's finished now for the season, but they were working over the last few weeks for area on their property, not on the county property. The permit was just for levee work on their own property. We agreed that in this partnership, if they're going to do work on our levees, that we wouldn't charge them permit fees. So that's the third one, says we'll waive our permit fees. The fourth one says the airport will pay all the cost to maintain all the levees on county property and on their property. The fifth one says that we're going to work together with the State Lands Commission, as Damon described, to swap the lands. The airport would have rights down to the point of mean low water to maintain the levees on the creek side, and that would be the limit of their interest. That any exchange would also give us all rights for navigational related operations.
Point of order, sir. Why are they getting permits for free?
I'd be glad to answer questions right when we get to the end. Is that all right?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. So the other, number 7 talks about the parcel boundary on the easterly land. So it's going to be, as Damon said, a revised levy location if the county gets a grant and moves that levy. Number 9 says that we'll pay for the cost for the State Land Commission work. 10 says until all the exchanges are done, we're going to have short-term leases to each other to accommodate their maintenance and any things we need to do regarding the docks. And 10 further kind of explains the issue with the South Fork and the navigational related operations. Talks about the Galenas Creek encroachments, that the owners can have docks and we would have authority to grant those permits, and that as the county code says, that the owner will be required to maintain those docks.
And you might want to point out that last.
Oh yeah, that last one's pretty important. We want to make sure that nothing in this MOU changes our assertion that the entire creek is subject to a public trust easement for the purpose of commerce, navigation, and fisheries. So we're not giving up any rights of that type at all. 11 says that the airport will work with us on future navigational projects. They will allow us to put dredge sediments onto their property if the county decides that's in the county's best interest. And right now we are looking at investigating some dredging for CSA 6, and we're looking at putting it on the McGinnis property. We're not really looking at this, but this gives us the opportunity if for some reason it's more cost effective or for any other reason that the airport has given us this authorization. And then as Damon stated, the term is for 10 years. We think that's more than enough time to get through the State Lands Commission process and get everything taken care of, but we set it out that far so that if there are some delays for some reason, we definitely have enough time and the partnership's in place. So then there's a map attached to the back. It's probably a little hard to see, but it kind of, the orange is the county-owned lands and the yellow is the airport-owned lands, and the orange is the areas that have levies on them. And this is the area that we're proposing to cross-lease, so those yellow areas would be leased to the airport, and any rights the airport has to the blue areas would be given to the county. So I went that pretty quickly because Damon kind of went through quite a lot of detail. I think we're ready to take questions now. Does that seem right? So, Susanna, did you want to do that?
Let me.
How do you want to?
Bring the mic around. Be happy to.
It needs to hold the transmitter.
Great.
If you could just go back to item number 11.
Sure.
I think I heard you say that, well, it might have been 11, that the county is looking at it, and then you further said the county's not looking at it. Was I confused?
Oh, for the dredging.
Yes.
Yeah, so the dredging. So the county is currently looking at the McGinnis Marsh, which is the second sentence.
Yes.
But this clause says that if the county decides we want to put it at the airport, that they've given us that permission.
So is that it? I didn't understand if you were saying that was something that the counties thought was an alternative or not.
It's an alternative, but it's not currently being considered. But as we get further along, if there's some reason that it starts to look more attractive, then the county could do that. And the CSA 6 board is the ones really engaged in advising us on those kind of things. And right now, we're pursuing the McGinnis Marsh.
I think we had a question about permit fees. Why don't we go there and get that one out of the way, then we'll continue to go around the round.
Thank you.
Good evening, ma'am.
Well, I'm just reading the last sentence here in item 11. County shall pay all design, permitting, construction costs related to this work. Earlier in this letter, I saw that the county will be paying for permitting. I'd like to know why that is. Thank you.
Okay, so this work relates to disposition of the dredge spoils. Is that right, Craig? So why don't we go back to the slide on the issue of paying for permits?
So number 3, so that one, I'm not sure if, I'll answer that one first. So the dredge project is something we're undertaking, we think for our benefit, so they didn't agree to pay those fees for us, that if we actually dredge the creek and put on McGinnis, they're not really that involved in that operation at all. So this one, number 3, says that for any work they do to repair levees that we own, that we would not charge them fees. And that's something that they asked for. We thought it was reasonable. This is staff. We're here to get your input tonight. If you feel differently, that we're here to get your feedback. The fees are just cover our staff time. They're not large fees, but we felt it was reasonable if they're going to spend considerably more work on levee construction and maintenance than we would spend on staff time.
Are they leasing some of those levies? And they actually, who do those levies belong to? The county is paying fees and the permits for it.
So the levies, there are levies today on their property and on our property. And the proposal is if the MOU is approved, we would issue leases to them for our land, and then ultimately we would swap the land and they would own it. So this, I guess, what I'm thinking it through. So once they own the land, this MOU is kind of over. Then they would have to come and get permits. That really, it's not for life. It's for the period of, while we're still in this kind of interim state.
Effectively, when they're maintaining and repairing ours.
Yes, but once it's theirs, then it's all theirs.
I believe the airport is covered by a covenant of use, a use covenant, a restricted covenant, and there's 3 signatories to it. I believe there's the property owner, there's the town of San Rafael, and there's the county. The county is.
You're talking about the airport soccer complex, or?
No, I'm talking about the whole, the covenant, the covenant.
Right.
Is the covenant, am I wrong in thinking that the covenant, one of the co-signers of the covenant is not the county? Because the county owns property there?
You could very well be right.
Well, I think that's very important because any change in the use of the airport needs to be signed off on by the county and San Rafael. And so my question is, would that status change with any of these changes to the east end of the airport?
The answer, in my view, is no. We're not looking at a change of use. We're just looking at maintaining and repairing levees.
I didn't know when you said the levee got moved back and it turned to tidelands. I just wanted to make sure that didn't change.
That's state tide, that is county-controlled land.
I think you've answered the question.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for the confusion, yeah. Robert.
Thank you. Craig, could you go back to the slide that mentioned the runway and the FAA regulations and moving the levee? I don't remember which number that was.
10 or 11.
I think it's earlier than that, but. I think it's 7. Okay, I don't want to get too technical here, but I'd like to see a map that shows where is the possible relocation of that levee. Because at the end of the runway, there's FAA Part 77, I looked into it, and there's a clear zone beyond the levee, or excuse me, within 200 feet of the runway and to the left and the right of it, to some extent, there can't be anything above the level of the runway. Then there's a rise, depending on the use in the airport, anywhere from 1 in 7 feet to 1 in 34 feet, where there can't be anything, or you can go up 1 foot for every 7 or to 34 feet. So by my calculations, I did just a rough map, is in the best of circumstance, less than 20% of the beak of the bird could be restored to wetlands. So Number 7 is somewhat illusory that we would get any restored wetlands there because of the provision that it has to be with FAA guidelines. So what I'd like to see is a map showing what percentage or what area, colored in orange, green, whatever color you want to make it, that could potentially be restored. And my other point is that I just want to reiterate is even in your MOU, they're claiming they own this land on the land on the, or have rights to the land on the south side of the creek. Nobody's established that they absolutely do, yet you are considering cross-leasing or trading land that is undisputed public property. So my request, of course, is for a map.
Great question, and my understanding is Craig has said map at the ready.
Something. Yeah, some caveats, though, to get to it. So we've not hired a aviation engineer. That's usually does that kind of work. We have a runway at Gnosfield, and we have people that specialize in that to do that kind of design for us. We did meet with the airport. They told us to use a 29-to-1 plane from the end of the runway up, and that no levees could break that plane. So staff did a little exhibit there. The red is where the levee could move to. But you sounds like you looked at and got different information. So ultimately, we'll have to have a study done. But this was kind of a quick concept based on what the airport told us that they operate under. But we have not done a detailed study. And then on the question about.
Could you pause a second?
Yeah.
And clarify that red line?
That would so the levee right now is kind of at the edge of the water. So the red line is where the levee could move into. So all that land further east could be restored.
And where's the property line as compared to that?
The property line, yeah, it's still farther in, I think. That's still on county land at that point. So then response to your other question about there are a lot of conflicting documents about who owns the creek. Their deed does show that, their ownership deed. There was a title report that was given that had an exclusion. So I'm not sure if it's insurable, those rights, since there was an exclusion in their title report. But their deed shows that. So the idea, as Damon said, just to clean all this up and get rid of those clouds in title. We're not trying to say that they have those rights. If it's worded that way, maybe it could be worded a little softer. But we're not trying to say that they have some right. We think the owners have rights. We think there's a cloud because of these conflicting ownership maps, and that the idea is to kind of move forward and clean those up.
Going back to paying for the levee maintenance and issuing free permits for the airport to do the grading and everything with, let's see, what is it? With no oversight. I called and they said that they've already been granted free permits to do the work that they've been doing for the last month, starting at 6:45 in the morning. So I want to know why they have been granted free permits to do that work already, even though the MOU hasn't even been agreed upon. And I've also supplied several documents showing that the county is not responsible for maintaining any of the levees, including the ones that are on county land. And I've asked for proof for a couple of years now, and I've never seen it. So if you could provide that, that'd be great. And
Can we just do 2 questions, 1 or 2 at a time?
Yeah,
Sure.
we can do that.
And I have no problem.
So yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about the permits and how there is oversight, actually, so.
So you're right, a permit was issued, I think I said that earlier, and I told you that we waived the fees, anticipating this MOU was going to go forward. If it never goes forward, then we probably will ask them to pay the fees.
Could you say the permit number, please?
The permit number,
Yeah, because some of these permits are hard to follow. So if you could-
I have a copy, if you just want to hang on a second, I'll give you the permit number.
And this is on their land.
County grading permit 16-2. And then regarding
You
the,
want to talk about the standard conditions?
oh, yeah, the permit has conditions, just like any other grading permit does. And we have inspectors, and they're required to have on-site geotechnical people to test it and write reports. We're waiving the permit fee, not the permit itself and all the conditions. They're fully required to comply with all permit conditions. So I could flip to that section.
And field inspection are included on that also, being waived. On number 3.
Why isn't this going back up? Sorry. Number 3. Okay. County will waive all county fees for permits. Doesn't say we're going to waive permits. It says we're going to waive all fees. So they're required to get all permits.
Right, permit fees, but also the
And
review and inspection, field inspection.
yes, permit fees, plan review fees, and field inspection fees. Those are all included in the amount of fees that are proposed to be waived.
Not the oversight, not the inspections.
Yeah, it'll still take place.
We got to make sure we're clear on
What's field inspections mean then?
fees.
It says field inspections, fees.
Fees.
Field inspection.
Right, and what field inspections will you be making as progress goes forward?
Do you have a copy of the permit?
Yeah, I have a
We
permit.
actually posted that online as well. And actually, folks,
So we can link the permit to this website, so it's easy to find if people want to read it. I'd be glad to do that. So there was a question about the ownership. I think we went over that. The state tidelands are, what's the second one? Yeah, per Chapter 898 of Statutes of 1975, the state granted the county title to that property. That property has levies upon it. It's generally the responsibility of a property owner to maintain the facilities on their property.
You said that there was
Hang on,
wording in that.
hang on. It's being filmed, so we want to make sure.
Okay. I thought you said there was wording in that legal document that granted the county, that said they had to maintain the levies. Because, just because they have the because the property's there, it's state land's property, and the city has told in their permit that was approved when Damon was on the council, is that the airport owner is supposed to maintain the levies. And there was Eric Steger wrote a letter, County Public Works, saying the county isn't responsible for maintaining any of the levies on the granted land. So where in that document does it say, in that grant, that the county is responsible for maintaining levies?
So why don't you talk about where things landed after the airport process as well as what you're referring to?
So as part of the, talk about the soccer complex and the letter that Eric Steger wrote. So the city of San Rafael was preparing an environmental document, and in that document, they were proposing that the county be responsible for all the levees and maintain them to a certain elevation and take on these duties. We didn't really want to take on those duties as part of their environmental document and be required to do that forever. So the letter was saying, we don't really want to have that duty. But as Damon described earlier, as an owner of property with a levy on it, we have some potential liability. So the county has made some decisions when there's levy failures to fix them. We don't have an active program where we're maintaining that levy like we do other levies, but it's reducing our liability exposure, and that's why we've repaired them in the past.
So no specific legal.
I've answered the question, I think we've answered it over and over, and I don't know how much clearer. We own the property, it has a levy on it.
Why don't we go back here, and then we're going to go over here. Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, come on up.
I don't want to go that far up. It's okay. I'm Barbara Salzman. I'm representing the Marin Audubon Society, and we have a long-time interest in this property. I remember going out shortly after, well, it wasn't so shortly after, it was acquired by Joe Shaku, and looking at other proposals that he had to build projects there. I have two concerns. One is following up on what Robert said about the wetlands. I wonder does the FAA have anything to say about this, or is the airport too small? Having commented and been through the Nos Field projects where the FAA objected to wetlands being developed so near that airport, would they have any input here? And if they did, I'm sure they'll object. Now, maybe you can get out of it, but it doesn't seem to me to be a sure thing that you're going to be able to get that benefit out of this project. But I have another question, which was really what I came to say. I think what I haven't heard here is any limits on what they could do with this dredge material. Because when you look at this, it looks like it's going to have probably good benefits to the county. You have to look at what's the benefit to the property owner. And what I'm concerned about is that it's going to be laid out on that, somewhere in that runway where they're going to be able to have more development potential. And I hope somebody's looked at that. If not, you need to.
Are you talking about dredge material from the creek?
Yeah, what it's, the MOU, I mean, of course, the MOU.
It's our decision.
Well, yeah, but it looks, it's something that they're anticipating out of this, so.
No, we make it clear that Plan A is McGinnis.
But it's well, yeah, but that's only temporary. That's not going to go, you said that's not going to go on.
Are we talking about the same dredge material?
Yes. Well,
okay.
I mean, eventually, McGinnis is going to be, well, the dredging needs to be done more frequently than every 10 years. McGinnis is probably going to take the dredge material pretty soon. I mean, maybe not in the next 6 months, but a year or two, you're hoping to do the project, which is great. But then after that, I would be concerned about development potential.
Okay, so I anticipate that if at some future time we were to decide to deposit dredge spoils on the airport, we would certainly do so with conditions, et cetera. But Craig, why don't you weigh in on that? And then Barbara, your other question was a good one. I imagine the FAA would want to weigh in on this.
Yeah, just to agree with that. The FAA is the federal agency responsible for aviation safety, so they do have safety guidance that needs to be followed. There's some things they are okay with into runways, and some things they don't like near runways. And so there's.
They don't like wetlands near the
They don't like diving birds, right?
Birds, right.
Yeah. Then regarding the use, so it's up to the county to decide whether the spoils would ultimately go to the airport or not. And as part of that process, the county could restrict the use. They've kind of said up till now that any spoils they get, they just want to improve levees. But I don't know what the future is, but that decision is not being made today, and that decision can be made later and can be reviewed at that time.
When we go over here, then we'll come on over. Yes, sir.
Can you bring up number 11? In terms of it's the counties can tell the airport where they want to put fill. The airport will accept Gallinas dredge sediments into airport property, et cetera, in locations to be mutually approved by the airport and the county. If the time comes and they don't want it, sounds to me like they can bail out.
Yeah, that's true. It's we didn't. The agreement doesn't have locations approved, and sorry, start over. That's true. The location, the agreement doesn't have locations already pre-selected, and that if we're ready to deposit dredge spoils there, they would have to tell us where they were willing to have them or not have them. So that's what the MOU says, that at some point we'd have to agree where.
It doesn't say that. It says may be used for any legal purpose. Sediment shall become the property of the airport and may be used for any legal purpose.
Well, they're going to be placed on locations that are mutually approved. So what typically happens is that they're placed and then they have to kind of dry out for a long time. And then after they're dried out, then the MOU says that they can use it for whatever they want. You're right. So the interim step is the mutual agreement is where they're going to decant, where they're going to sit for a while and dry out.
So, excuse me, does that mean after it's usable for something else, they can get a permit to put it any place that's, at this point, the city of San Rafael allows them to put it, actually goes out of the county hands completely?
If they're doing work in the city of San Rafael, then the city of San Rafael has permit authority.
What I'm saying is that dredge material then can be used by the airport, only with, the county's actually out of the process at that point. Because the dredge material.
Yes.
Okay.
I think you're right.
Becomes a San Rafael issue.
If it's going to be placed in San Rafael.
Well,
If it's placed on a levee in county jurisdiction, then we would have grading permit authority.
We're going to go over here at this point, get some new folks. Russ.
So recent studies have shown that the clapper rail have vanished from there. And if you give the responsibility of maintaining the levee to the airport, what kind of controls can we have to make sure that they encourage the clapper rail to return and that they don't even make it worse so that they'll never return?
Great question again, and I'm assuming environmental issues are dealt with in the permitting process, but Craig, why don't you address that?
So I'll describe what's in their current permit. So the permit requires under special condition 2 that they submit a construction management plan. And in that construction management plan that was approved with the permit, there's a document that says work schedule and hours of operation. Grading may be performed only during the period of September 1st through January 31st. So that's the restriction regarding the wildlife breeding season. Grading permit 16-2, the same one I've been talking about.
We've already cited the number, Ed, but we'll.
Grading permit 16-2, the only grading, the same permit we've been talking about 3 times.
from Fish and Wildlife.
Talking about a grading permit issued by the County of Marin to do levee construction.
Take permit for that previous levee work from Fish and Wildlife?
No. The permit does, I'll just respond to that. The permit requires the applicant under Section 16, applicant's responsibility to other approvals, entitlements, and permits. Applicant is responsible for coordinating and complying with all further other conditions and requirements of other agencies, including but not limited to California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So that's on the applicant to comply with any permit conditions that are imposed by those agencies.
Could you please clarify if this permit, I just wanted to please, this isn't my question, I had a question, 2 questions actually before. Could you clarify if this permit would expire once the actual property exchange occurs, if this agreement is signed? Was I correct in hearing you earlier when you said that the permits would be issued to the leased property, the levies being leased from the county in the interim, a 3-year interim period? So at the end of that, if there is indeed a land exchange, would this then not have any bearing on that?
That's very likely, but this current permit's only good for 2 years, so it's scheduled to expire already in 2 years. So they'd apply for a new permit. And if the land ownership changed, as you just mentioned, I think that would require a new permit because the foundation's different and the roles, so that would require a new permit.
So
So this one's only good for 2 years, and then if we actually exchange the lands and they actually own it, they'd have to come in and get a new permit for that also.
You want to ask your other two questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, so my name's Gina Hagan, and I was actually curious about a couple of things. I feel like my first thing is just going to be more of a comment because I don't think that it's the purpose of this meeting to address this issue, but I just wanted to ask if the MOU were approved in its current form or something similar, if that would impact the dredging, the planned dredging that's going to occur on the south fork of Galenas Creek, and if so, how? Because I know that's a significant concern to a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. But the question that I'm hoping you can answer now, if you can answer the other question, that'd be great. But so how would county ownership of the creek and the properties that the airport is asserting possible ownership of, or just straight up saying that they own part or a portion of properties along Vendola on the other side of the creek, how would that impact the property owners once the county, if the county were to take control of that? Because that's still, I think, a really important concern.
Another great question.
I'm remembering the second one, and the first one was about
Dredging.
dredging. Yeah, so as we mentioned, the permit allows dredging, spoil deposit on the airport property, which we're not really pursuing, but it does allow us that. The other thing it probably has some benefit potentially is that it gives us authority to handle any dock encroachments without getting them involved. So there's that cloud over who owns that property, as Damon mentioned. This would give us the authority to make those decisions with the property owners, and they would have no part in it. So that's kind of another benefit. Other than that, it really doesn't have much to do with the dredging. We assert we have the rights to dredge today. We don't need their permission. We can do it and take it to McGinnis.
So talk about number two, though. And I tried to touch on it a little bit in my remarks.
Number two, yeah, that is a very, very complex. I don't think the intent is for the, if it's worded that way, then they probably need to clean it up a little bit. The intent isn't for the county to be the next person to be involved in the cloud and the title. The intent is for those owners that own those lots to own them and have all the clouds go away. So the airport's clouds would go away, any county clouds would go away. It would just clean up the property line.
So it's only a cloud because the airport's asserting ownership and not because it says it?
Well, it's shown in their deed that way.
It is.
Yeah, so, without going through all the deeds, there's conflicting information in the deeds. The property owners have deeds that show they own that lot, and they have a deed that has a different boundary than the boundary in the subdivision map where those lots are. So the idea is just to clean it all up. They've agreed to get rid of any interest they have in this MOU, so that's the goal, is just to clean that up.
Thank you.
I have so many, I'll just take a couple right now. First of all, I want to make a comment, and that's about sediment. Sediment, the bay is becoming sediment starved. Sediment is going to become a valuable resource. I would like everybody to be aware of that. So the airport isn't taking something off your hands, it's actually getting something of value. So that really, I'm sure the county's very aware of that. But I want everybody else to be aware of that as well. So if the county, so we get these boundary lines cleared up, and then there's redwood boxes that the county has done on the Vendola properties in order to protect those properties. Is that responsibility going to revert to the homeowners then, or is that still county property because they built those boxes and put them in? And does the county have liability, just the way they had liability on state lands?
So the levee along the south side, a lot of it's on private property. We've been well, it's disputed. Yes, I'm sure that if those levees failed and there was litigation, everybody would be named, and then there would be a long thing to sort it out. But the idea is we really haven't. This MOU does not contemplate any changes to the way the San Luis and Venetia community levee's been maintained. It's being maintained, but with Zone 7 funds, and that's That's the plan for it to continue. This MOU is between the airport and the county. It's not really between the county and the Santa Benicia neighborhood.
I understand, this is just a follow-up to what would happen afterwards when we go through all this process, so I think it's a legitimate question.
Of course. All these questions are legitimate,
Yeah.
so please keep them coming. That's why we're here.
I know, appreciate that.
I'm just working my way around the room. We'll get to everyone.
I'm wondering about monitoring the levee improvements and any kind of environmental review that's required. I know that when you build up, even though it says that you're supposed to just, the MOU is allowing them to build up and on the property, whenever you build up, you have to stabilize it also on the other side somehow. And that, to me, with sea level rise and the mean high of the creek is getting higher, that there's going to be impact on the creek. And to me, it seems like the Regional Water Quality Board and the Fish and Game should be giving permits for those. And if the county is just saying are giving a permit and we're not charging fees for these, I'm wondering where the oversight comes in on the levee improvements by the airport.
And again, that sounds like a variation of a couple other questions, so maybe make it clear this time.
So the MOU does not address the type of permits to be issued, so the type of permits are going to reflect whatever plans they prepare. The current permit was issued, was reviewed and determined to be CADX under CEQA. The resource agencies were consulted. They felt that they didn't have any permit jurisdiction, so they didn't require permits for the type of work that's being done here. If they propose to do a different type of work, which creekside filling, like you mentioned, something like that, I'm sure that would completely change the type of permit and the regulation and the requirements. But this was almost all the work's being done on the airport side, which is away from the resource. So that's how it was reviewed and permitted. So if they change and they want to do something big, they want to, then it would be reviewed based on the facts of the permit.
Was there a 30-day review period with the CADX? Was there any kind of, when you gave the CEQA exemption or the environmental, there was a 30-day review period for the public?
No, I'll answer. Okay. So under CEQA, when a categorically exemption determination is made, there's a 45 statute period for somebody to challenge legally. For us to issue a grading permit, our code requires us to have a 5-day appeal period. So that was what the notice was. Went out to the community for a 5-day appeal period, and no appeals were filed. So that's the process under our code.
Could I just ask one more question? And it's about the McGinnis Marsh.
I'm wondering how, if any consideration has been, I know the county's been planning extensively on McGinnis Marsh restoration for sea level rise and possibly connecting Miller Creek back to Galenas Creek. And I'm wondering if the consultants who've been working on that project have had a chance to review the hydrology of when you connect Miller Creek back up to the North Fork of Galenas Creek and how that beak is shaped and moving the levee back, or whether, I know you have hydrologists and geomorphologists on that project, and I'm wondering if they were able to review this MOU and how that might impact that project.
As a matter of fact, we had a meeting yesterday. That project's being led by the County Parks Department, and we had a meeting just to kind of check in with staff, and we discussed that project, and I brought this forward. They are getting ready to hire a consultant to engage in design. It'll be going to the board, I think, January probably. And so that study that Parks is going to be overseeing will be looking at, like you said, Miller Creek, reconnecting. It'll be looking at issues. It'll be looking at whether those changes have some impact on this nose area and what configurations are appropriate. So they'll be looking at those areas.
Thanks, Damon.
Hi, can you bring up the blue area, the map with the blue area on it? So it's crazy that the state's going to take 3 years to do this. Really, they should have ownership to the middle of the creek and no more than that. Anything that they're claiming would be due to accretion. What's the process that we're presenting to the state here to get them to do the right thing here and come back with that, at least as a result? Is there any interface we can have with the state to make sure that they know our issues here? I'm not sure how that's been presented. And is there any interface we can have with them before the 3 years is up and not be presented with something that's a disaster?
So we have had some consultation with the state, and really what needs to happen to make this happen is you need willing property owners. So if the airport is willing, which will help us make those kind of exchanges. If they were unwilling, then the state probably wouldn't going to take action to force them to do something. So because they're willing, it helps us. We really haven't laid out that process. There's going to be a lot of technical documents. We definitely will find a way to have the community participate in that and understand what we're doing. We really want to try to agree on what the in-state should be and then figure out what all the documents that need to happen to make that occur and not get too hung up on the historical because you mentioned accretion. You know, water law is very complex versus man-made versus natural accretion. That actually changes boundaries in different ways. And the state made a lot of surveys and they conflicted and some had discrepancies. So it's very, very complicated, but the goal is to move forward to an ultimate state that's much simpler.
And that presentation is going to be made public and
Yeah.
feedback before you do that?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Is that happening soon?
Well, the process, as we've outlined it, is if this MOU goes forward and the airport and the board both sign it, then we would start that process. At this point, we're getting feedback to see if the community thinks that we're on the right track. So we're kind of here to answer questions and take comments.
I'm going to catch you on the way back.
One is a statement, being on the flood control board, is my hope, since the county is putting the resources to clear the property for the homeowners on the creek, that we could tie in that we have access to maintain the heights of those levees, because there's a few people that don't want people in their backyards for whatever reasons, but we're all affected. The levee goes, we're all going to be in the same non-boat, so to speak. And I'd just like to state my feeling on it. I think that mud in the called sediment is you know, it's like gelatinous. And I know I live 200 feet from the creek, and I had to do a soil sample when I remodeled. And you go down 2.5 feet, and it's bay mud. So I think that mud is just coming out from underneath the houses myself. But that's just my thoughts.
Okay. Well, hi, John Prulis. I'm videotaping this thing, so I'm not going to be in it. But am I correct in assuming that an EIR wasn't triggered by the MOU, or that is a challenge that has to be raised at some future point in time?
That's correct. We've not prepared an EIR for this.
Yeah, I attended and filmed a recent conference by the Galenas Watershed Council, which featured a presentation by Clapper Rail. Now, it's known as a Ridgeway rail by Jules Evans, and he's done recent studies on the birds' movements. And I'd have to disagree with Russ. There are two populations at the creek right now. One is near Contempo Marin, and the other's on the far east side. And they use that, according to Jules Evans, they use that north channel of the creek to migrate. And I don't have any confidence that the airport is a good environmental steward. all kinds of red flags go up in my mind when I think of them maintaining the levee. Also in that seminar, it's online, by the way, if you go to the Galinas Watershed Council, the video is up there, and you could see it. My understanding is that the county is intending to make some major improvements on the soccer field to the west of the golf course. There's a major event remodeling, bulldozing. So that would be occurring in between the SMART train tracks and the current location of the land soccer complex there. So I would think that all these impacts, I mean, the airport wants to drive 100 piles in to, sink the footings for their building. There's going to be this county thing with bulldozing. Now, this memorandum of understanding, it looks like you're giving responsibility to these really important levees to an entity that has not really demonstrated environmental merit in the community, in spite of their, display of solar cells. I mean, I applaud that, but, there's more to environmentalism than putting solar cells on your roof. So, I'm just wondering what's the likelihood of an EIR? And shouldn't there be a supplemental EIR because of the recent changes in the movement of the rails and all these new developments slated to happen?
All right, you covered a few topics there. So one was the Santa Fe regulated soccer complex. We're not involved in that, the monitoring of that, and whether what's required for their environmental compliance. That's a question that the city of Santa Fe would be better to answer than the county. And then,
I think he's talking about the soccer field on the
yeah, I was going to cover them. And then you also mentioned a soccer field at the McGinnis Park. I'm not familiar with that project. That's a county parks project. If that's of interest, we could get some more information about that. I'm not really familiar with the details. And then
I think the third one
was just
again the overall theme.
Yes.
What oversight is going to be in place and permitting around future maintenance of that?
So we have, our staff and require in the permit for the airport to have professional staff to do testing and monitoring and other usual things you do with the levee. And you were kind of alluding to why doesn't the county just maintain it all? It's actually, the issue really is it's very expensive. We don't have the revenues to maintain that whole levee system.
Well, and again, just going back to my remarks, again, I heard overwhelmingly from the community, why are you maintaining the levees? Why are you paying for that? If I'm hearing tonight that we should, that's probably something I need to know. But hold that thought. We're going to keep working our way out. Ed Yates, attorney at law, you have a question?
Thanks, Damon. I got several comments and a couple of questions.
Why don't you hold
Would that be all right? That would be great. Thanks. Yeah, I'm Ed Yates. I'm a land use and environmental attorney in Larkspur, and I'm speaking tonight on behalf of a community group in Santa Venetia called Stop the Giveaway. So first I'll start off with a question because it kind of follows up some of what you're talking about with CEQA. I wasn't quite clear. You said there was a categorical exemption granted for the MOU or for a grading permit?
That was for the grading permit.
It was for the grading permit. Right. So no CEQA has been done at all for the MOU?
Not at this point, no.
Okay. Just to comment on that, the MOU, as people have very interestingly, strikingly have pointed out, that MOU could facilitate later development that the grading permit may not contemplate. So I guess I would suggest taking a close look at that and not jumping to a Cat X and calling it a day. There could be lots of other issues there. Regarding the MOU and some of the property issues, first,
So when you say it would, the MOU itself would facilitate development, so that's above and beyond maintenance and repair of the levee otherwise? What do you mean by that?
somebody, I think this gentleman here, this woman here, I think mentioned something about the dredged spoils and that they could be later used to place somewhere to be used for any kind of residential development or whatever. Whether or not it's zoned for that or not, it doesn't really matter. CEQA calls for examination of indirect impacts where there is a secondary possibility where growth is possibly facilitated. So it could go beyond that. I'm not saying it absolutely is, but I think that just needs to, the county needs to take a look at that. Regarding the MOU and some of the property issues, first, the California Constitution, Article 16, Section 6, prohibits the giving of public funds to any private entity, and that's any kind of entity or person. And that is apparently seems to be coming up in this context. From what I've seen, there are some pretty serious issues about a possible gift of public funds. The county, in 2011 litigation, in a mediation brief authored by Marin County Council, asserted that the county owned that blue area, or at least portions of it. So at this point, the county has made a legal claim in court that it has asserted some ownership over that. I haven't read all the filings and all the pleadings, but just on the face of it, the mediation brief seems to say that the state, Lands Commission, and the county have asserted some ownership over that. So if that indeed is the case, if that, it may not be, there may be other pleadings, Damon's shaking his head saying no, if it's not, that's fine.
If you read the stuff and see that would be great. I think gift of public funds, absolutely. Everything we do is governed by the state constitution. There would obviously have to be equal or greater value. We know that.
Well, so one of the things I've seen here, that Section 11 says the county will pay for all permits, environmental permits. So I'm, in a previous life, I was a consultant with an environmental consulting agency, Tetra Tech. Just off the top of my head, I'd say regarding gift of public funds that those permits could well cost the airport up somewhere around $100,000 to get those permits. You're talking about Regional Water Quality Control Board, BCDC, 404 from the Corps of Engineers, and a take permit possibly from Fish and Wildlife, and maybe from National Marine Fisheries Service. Those are very expensive, time-consuming permits the county has agreed to pay for. I'm not sure what it's getting in value for that. The other part is possibly if Fish and Wildlife Service requires contribution to a mitigation bank for the Ridgeway's rail, then the cost of that mitigation could be in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 7 figures, maybe more. So I think the county just needs to take a look at that. It needs to determine, again, if it's making a gift of public funds, and regarding issues for that, it's not just the county in the hook, right? Liability can be personal under the Political Reform Act for those issues regarding gift of public funds. So it could be that whoever signs that MOU, whatever body signs the MOU. So I just take a real hard look at that. It seems to me that issue, also the Public Resources Code and the Public Trust Doctrine prohibit the alienation of submerged lands, public trust properties. Only in certain instances can cities and counties alienate or transfer those submerged public trust lands. So those are some tough issues. There's some tough legal issues. I think there's, hopefully you'll be able to get those. Thanks, Jamie.
No, I already said we're going with new people.
I think the things I'm asking are clarification of things that have been said. And so could you please clarify if the MOU is agreed upon by all entities, then and then that can happen before we find out from the FAA or before we find out what the true boundaries are of the of any of the property? Is that it?
So the MOU in its current state has been negotiated by staff, me, and the rest of the department, and the airport. So ultimately, it's going to go to the Board of Supervisors and be considered by all 5 board members in an open hearing. They have not considered it yet. So the current state is just a draft for public comment. And we don't have the resources right now to do those studies to look at how to restore the tip. So that's the intent, is to look for grant funding to undertake that kind of project. So we're not at this point, we're not anticipating that we would have a study done that would show you what the ultimate configuration of that levee could potentially be.
But, so, I don't know if you answered the question. So.
Oh, yeah, sure, sorry.
And I'm not saying what's right or wrong here, I just would like clarification. So the MOU could be signed and agreed upon before we know what the actual survey of the property is, and before we know anything from FAA about if they will allow wetlands at the end.
Yeah, the MOU provides a framework for us to move forward to answer those questions. So that's the way it's intended to do. It's the 2 parties agree they're going to move forward together, and we're going to get answers to those questions with the FAA and with state lands.
So the MOU could just fold at that point if we find out that the FAA says, no, you can't do that.
If it turns out the FAA says, no, you can't make any changes at all, then you're right, there would be no project there.
You have to go back to the drawing board, or would it go forward just without?
Well, then, yeah, that part wouldn't be part of the.
And also state lands could blow up this deal as well. I mean, we're assuming state lands would approve even what the objectives are. Am I right?
Yeah, we've met with the staff, and they seem supportive. They spent a lot of time on this over the years, too, answering questions about the conflicting documents. They kind of want to settle it and resolve it once for all themselves.
I don't often speak real clearly, so.
Okay, sorry.
Maybe it's the way I'm asking the question. But if the MOU is signed,
Yes.
let's just say it's signed this way after some tweaks or something, and then that happens in the next 3 or 4 months or 2 months, and then there's time for the FAA to come in and make their clarification, or the survey map shows something different. Does the airport property still then get all the things given to them that are in the MOU, despite the fact that we might not be able to have wetlands, or we might not be able to, whatever?
I think the intent would be no, and maybe we need to clean that up. Again, though, I will go back to a question to the community, okay? And it's in emails I've gotten. I can cite them if you'd like. Some people in the community are saying just give it to the airport and make them take care of the levee. I'm also hearing our environmental community and some residents say, no, keep that and try to restore it. Those are the 2 options here. So we can clarify that that's important enough to us that if that doesn't happen, there's no deal. It's still speculative even on where the line would be. We're assuming, that the FAA would approve that line where we think it would be. The fallback position, again, in all of this is we're back to who's responsible for maintaining and how should we deal with that issue. So am I hearing that folks would rather just blow up the whole deal? Do folks want a fallback position to be that the airport still is responsible for maintaining that levee? Or do we go back to maintaining it?
I'm not saying one thing's right or wrong.
No, I know that, and I'm not arguing with you. I'm just trying to
History with the airport
frame the issues.
owners is that they will take an MOU written with one kind of intention, and a year or two later, take it off in a whole other direction. That if that MOU is not clarified.
Right, so we probably need to think about what's our bottom line and how to build in the right contingency that if the FAA does not agree that X is possible, then there's no deal overall, or that piece. So fair point. I mean, I wouldn't mind some feedback on it. Because I think there's different points of view in this room. There are folks in this room who have sent me emails saying the airport should control that land and maintain the levees.
Hi, I'm Monty Smith. 3 questions, comments. The main levees that go along the creek, this MOU isn't going to change those, right?
So,
on the airport side?
Correct. On both the unincorporated, so there's unincorporated land in that mix, there's state tidelands, and then there's city. So why don't you talk to that? The point is to harmonize all of them.
So the MOU provides for maintenance of the airport levies in the unincorporated area. It doesn't really have anything to do with airport levies in the city. Well, maintenance includes, sometimes they settle, so it could be raising them, a little bit. Not moving them, yeah, except for the one at the tip that we talked about. But the other ones across the creek from the community, there's no, it doesn't end, it anticipates maintenance, not moving them one way or the other.
So this latest grading permit raises the levee up to 3 feet in its current configuration, some of which is on county land.
Okay, I don't have the plans here, but if that's what, if you looked at them, then okay.
So it could be 3 feet
So that's,
Could be tall.
yes.
I'm not worried about the airport, keeping the airport from flooding. I think they'll do a good job. Then the other question I had was the dredging spoils. I've heard for a long time that that one of the reasons that we haven't been dredged in 40 forevers is there's no place for the spoils. So why is it written into this that the airport gets the spoils? Is that good for us? Are we looking for a place for the spoils?
So again, McGinnis Marsh is our preferred location. Were we to decide that we needed another location and wanted to use the airport, this gives us the opportunity.
And would they then have to sign off on that in the future? Is it a joint agreement? It sounds like in the language it's a joint agreement. So we get into this thing and grant them the MOU, and then they say, well, we don't want the spoils? Is that a possibility?
No, in that it gives us the right to exercise that option.
Okay. And then one last comment. We live at 107, so we're pretty far up. And the the airport, we see the airport's levy over there on the other side, and we see a lot of clapper rail activity over there. They're pretty happy with it, and I think they'll be even happier if the place gets dredged, because they like the water.
Thanks. Any other new voices? Yes, sir.
I have just, I was wondering, did you initiate this MOU, or did the airport initiate it?
Again, going back to my opening remarks, I did, after I was alerted to the community's concerns about shelling out potentially $200,000 for the levee repair 2 years ago. Now, it turns out, and Craig may be able to talk to this, these ideas, at least, have been floating around for a while, not surprisingly, with all the historical issues going on. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I guess taking all the public comment that I had heard into account, try to pull something together, at least for consideration, that evolved over time. Originally, the assumption, again, based on what I'd heard, is that the community might be interested in just handing over the tip to the airport and assigning all responsibility to them. Then I heard pretty strong voices, most notably from the environmental community, that no, let's hold on to that land and in fact try to move the levee back, subject to FAA. So it's kind of been an iterative process, and obviously isn't done yet. Again, this is a draft, so that's why we're here.
The follow-up question there, Damon, is was there any indication of what the airport, is there any indication of what the airport would like to do with the acquirement of the land that they would receive in this MOU? What they would actually do with that land? Do they have some projects planned?
No, I think someone hit it on the head. I mean, obviously, it's in their interest to maintain the levees. Again, don't think anyone's disputing it. Primarily protects levee or airport land. There are some other properties at stake, from what staff tells me. If you envision that area as a bowl, if there's a significant break, you have the smart tracks back in the back and the mobile home park. So that's kind of at issue. So for me, it's really what is the county's exposure? The thought has been suggested by some as let's just try it out in court. Don't repair, see what happens, and then let's test the theory that really it's completely clear that the airport's responsible for everything in court. That's not my job.
All right. You've been waiting a while.
Oh, were you going to answer on any historical?
Oh, yeah, so just historically, yeah. So it's been going on for a long time. There's documents that Hannah is our researcher. She's found really old documents in the file where people thought it made sense to get the airport to maintain these levees. And for a variety of reasons, we weren't able to come to any terms that either side would even accept. And now we have some terms that staff and the airport think we're comfortable recommending, but we want to get the public input. Up until now, there's never been even close to any terms. So this is really the farthest it's ever gotten, but I think they go back 60s, so 50 years of confusion about who's supposed to do what out there.
Okay, we're going to go here. Actually, Robert's new, then we're going to go here, and then Francis. Oh, you did? How can I forget?
I think that the county and the county needs to drive a harder bargain with the airport. The question of whether any wetlands will get restored at the Beak of the Bird, I think, is significant. And why not put something in there like the airport will guarantee to restore X acres, and if it's not at the Beak, it can be somewhere else on their property. But let's drive a harder bargain here, because it seems like they're getting an awful lot, and we're not getting much. I'd also just like to add that one of those provisions was about not diluting the county's right to navigation or any other rights. Well, I think that also includes riparian rights to wharf out, which means that property owners on the south side of Galenas Creek have the right to wharf out to the navigable channel. So we're not really getting anything from the airport in that respect. And I happen to be knowledgeable about this because I was one of the 2 people that was sued by the airport for my dock encroachment. Proclaimed dock encroachment. It turns out it's not.
So I think Robert's teed up the issue well. So how do folks feel? I mean, should that, restoration, meaning that there has to be, let's even call it roughly what we've seen in terms of FAA allowance in stone, or equivalently some other restoration, otherwise all bets are off? Are folks, again, the downside is, let's say FAA, the third party comes in and says, actually it's going to be way further back. Do we then walk away knowing that, okay, we're back at square one with likely shared levee repairs at a minimum? Is that, Judy, you're a yes?
No, this is actually, I want a point of clarification.
Sure.
About the environmental position for the restoration. We had suggested that, yes, the county has maintained these levees over time, and, rightly so. We'd suggested that they offer a letter to the airport saying that they, according to state lands, don't any longer have to maintain those levees. There's no responsibility from the State Lands Commission that actually owns those lands, which just can't be given away, to maintain the levee. So that give the airport 4 or 5 years to build an inboard levee on their land that would protect their property. And in 5 years, the county would let whatever happens to the Beak of the Bird and that levee go. So it's a little bit different. And I just wanted to make that clarification point.
No, and I think I did state that position earlier, and maybe I'm being a little bit, kind of to the point on it, but it is the roll the dice theory. Because then you don't have a levee, unless they decide to put one up.
Oh,
And did the county put those levees up originally? So who's responsible for the levees?
Well, again, you've been responsible for the Beak of the Bird.
Right.
And over time.
Okay.
The state lands have said that you don't have to have a levee there. Now, I know that Oberkampfer, the engineer, has said that this levee around the airport protects the properties upstream, but that's patently absurd. Because if you notice how the water moves up the creek, it would hit all those properties equally as it moves up the creek on both sides of the airport. Those levees along the airport only protect the airport land. They do not protect Contempo. They don't protect the smart tracks, because as the water moves up, it moves up like this. It doesn't, it's not like held back.
I will tell you that our internal experts disagree. So what position am I in? On behalf of all taxpayers, do we go to court and roll the dice?
I'm not.
Okay, just on the basis that you think that we're not responsible for the levy.
Well, I made 2 points. One is that the county could start saying we are abdicating our responsibility to maintain the levee on the point.
Which we're doing through the agreement.
Well, yes, except that doesn't mean, because of this FAA piece, it may not mean, and this is getting back to your point, it may not mean, if the airport levee had to have if their runway had to have that space, they would have to move their levee back even further. Or they would have to move their runway back even further if they needed to put the levee at their property line. So if we were to abandon that Beak of the Bird, whatever the FAA says, whatever the airport has to do, they would put the inboard levee on their property line, and they'd have to let the chips fall where they may as far as where the airport runway goes. That was my intention in what I was trying to state, so I hope that clarifies that, rather than we're going to modify where that levee is going to fall based on what the FAA says. And again,
So I guess I'm not fully, and so you're saying you would like the levee at the property line. So essentially, that'd be great, except the runway would be unusable unless the FAA disagrees. So you think they're going to agree to that?
I have a question.
I guess I'm not really following this argument.
Is there any cost incurred by the county by asking the FAA to weigh in right now on the options? I mean, why don't we not make any assumptions, get the information from the FAA and work from from that level of information on the MOU?
I mean, that sounds reasonable. So is the consensus from the group that this is such a key part of the deal that we need to maximize possible wetlands restoration there to strike a deal with the airport? And thus, I think it probably would be good to get clarification from the FAA on that.
David, I just want to add a piece of information.
Could you please get on the mic?
Yeah, so.
In that extra piece at the end of the runway is bringing in actually bigger airplanes. Because right now, they're not using the entire runway. They're using the west side of the runway, which they were not supposed to use. The taxi area has now been turned into a runway, which they were not allowed to do, but nobody's monitoring it. And so this whole thing, that point which you think is a problem, they just want more land so they can have bigger runway space.
Well, they're giving it up, though. That actually isn't consistent with the agreement being proposed. They're willing to give it to us. You know, it's ours, so that's not even the right terminology for it. But I think what you're saying is some hidden agenda to actually increase the runway. Well, that would be foreclosed by this deal. Number one, it would be in writing. But number two, I think I'm hearing a broader point that we actually want to nail that down or even see about moving it in a little bit more closer to the current terminus of the runway. I'm open to that if that's what the group wants.
How sure are we that FAA has anything to say about this? And I think Michael McRae might have something to say about that.
Not really, no, actually. Okay. No, actually.
We can find out.
You know, you can find out, because as we know, the airport management has played both sides of the FAA question. The management at the airport have played both sides of the FAA question. And that's why sometimes they evoke the rulings of the FAA as applicable to this airport. And other times they say, no, it's a private airport, so it does not fall under those restrictions. And that's why I think it's very important that, and I agree, that we should find out where the FAA stands on this.
I'd just like to say in the midst of all the comments that I do really think it's a good idea what you're trying to do. You know, to get clarity in exchange for, just get things clear.
But some really good issues are being raised tonight.
I did too. I like how it's moving forward, considering some of the information I had read over the last couple of weeks, that this goes back to 1870, 1872. My question, it sounded like there were issues regarding the permitting fee on different levels. And is it possible in this kind of situation that you could, I'm making the assumption that that was built in as a goodwill gesture?
Right.
Is there, having heard the feedback tonight, is there a way to build in a cap? I don't know if it's a $200 or.
I think that's a good suggestion. Craig?
Yeah, I'll just, I mean, I appreciate.
Susanna's taking
Yes.
notes.
I appreciate the feedback. So in general, the airport's proposal was, we'll do all the construction work, we control that. You do the permit side, because you control how much time you spend on staff. So it's kind of, you do that piece, we'll do our piece. And that was the partnership. And, you know, you could have comments whether you think that's good or bad, but that's kind of what the premise was. So absolutely, we could put a cap on it. I mean, we have a lot of options.
Okay, we're going to go here, Francis, and then Robert.
Sorry, I may have missed this before, but can you give us a ballpark figure about what these, what all these potential gives are, dollar amount? Like, is it $20,000 or $200,000 ballpark? Do you have any idea?
I would be guessing, but I think it's, you know, it's just staff time and how many hours they spend on it. So I'm thinking it's more in the 20,000 than in the 200, because they just didn't spend that many hours on it. There's just not that many hours in the day. So that's my guess. But I don't have the exact numbers.
I'd just like to say I have a reaction when Robert was saying he doesn't think we're getting enough and you should drive a harder bargain. I think that this, you know, as long as I've been involved in anything in Santa Venetia, this issue just continues on. And I really see that what you're doing is putting, you know, an end to the merry-go-round to nowhere. And I'm really grateful and think you've done a pretty good job to put this together, and I don't want to see you abandon it. You know, if there's ways to improvement by the way the public is giving you input, great. But I think the basic is something that Santa Venetia really wants.
Thanks, Russ. I guess one question we can ask a little bit later after we get all the input is kind of framework-wise or concept-wise, is this something to go forward with? I think we have heard some good suggestions, like cap on fees, and also probably some more investigation on FAA, if that is a key deal point to the whole thing, and I'm seeing sufficient heads nodding on that one. So I think do we have one more comment over here? We're going to go over to Francis at this point, at long last.
Thank you. Craig, could you put up that slide with the cross lease that shows the two areas? What I'm concerned about is the blue area. It looks like a lot of land there, but the airport, in their legal description, they do not own the land under the mean high tide. And most of the land in the creek is under the mean high tide. So there is only, above the mean high tide in the airport, supposed airport boundaries under the 1870 survey, there's like 15 parcels that, and if you hold it up a little bit, so see that pink area right there? That's all they really own that is not under the mean high tide.
I put your map in here because I thought you might do this,
So-
you want me to bring it up?
Okay. So I don't understand, and if this state lands, thank you. That's nice, okay.
No, it's something that Francis emailed to me.
So what I did was I took this state,
You want? Sure.
this,
You want us to post it on the website?
so that kind of hatched area, the blue is the creek, and the blue with the little lines on it, that's the area under the mean high tide that the airport doesn't own.
Oh, sure. So,
Okay.
you're just making a presentation now, right? I don't hear.
No, my question is, okay, state lands, What?
The mic, can you use the
Okay.
mic?
State Lands said that, told Ellen and I that they would, if they do any exchange, they would want to make sure that the land that's being exchanged is equal value, et cetera. Now, when you, on your map, it looks like they're exchanging a lot of land, but how can they exchange something they don't own? They don't own that land. So, and then my other question is, if this exchange doesn't go through, because there's a whole lot of stuff that has to be done. It's very expensive, move the levee, restore the wetlands, get all the permits, do all the surveying. If that doesn't go through for some reason, it seems like the MOU says you're going to give them a 10-year lease exchange. Is that correct? That's part of the MOU? How can, on those pink lands, if some of those are on private property, if some of the land that the airport is claiming is not just the marsh, but actually extends into, let's say, Charles' land, because his is one of those pink properties? Okay, if it extends into his property, how can they exchange his property or lease his property to the county? Have these homeowners whose lands are affected, have they been involved in these discussions?
So regarding the state lands, you said that they told you that any exchange needs to be of equal value, or was that the phrase? Equal or greater. So that'll be, if that's the requirement, that'll be the requirement. We don't have any way to modify that. So when it goes through, we'll figure that out. I mentioned earlier that you said that you sent me a title report, and it does show an exception for the creek, but that their deed does include the creek. So the title report says that the title company is not willing to give them insurance. So there's still a cloud there, and the intent, as Damon's described, is just to clean all this up once and for all. So, I mean, if you feel like we should just ignore that and leave that cloud of ownership in the creek, then that's an option. But the option we're looking at is just cleaning up once and for all.
But they would still own it if the exchange didn't go through. You have a 10-year lease, right? The 10 years lease exchange, was that?
The MOU is for 10 years, and the MOU says that the goal is to exchange the property, and until that occurs, there'd be interim leases.
Okay, so until that occurs, we don't know when that is going to occur, if ever. So interim leases, the leases could go on in perpetuity then. Is that right?
No, I don't think the county can give leases for perpetuity, so it would have a term.
A 10-year lease, and then it could be renewed for another 10 years or something?
Potentially.
Okay, so again, if the airport is leasing the land, okay, above the mean high tide there, and on people's properties, if they're leasing the land, to the county, they still own that land. So it's not really cleared up until they quit claim it. And, you know, I don't understand why, I mean, I think the real purpose that it should be for the county to make sure that they don't have any, you know, okay, you know, if we were given riparian rights, and the way that the county, set up the subdivision, and there was no. Okay.
I understand. You obviously know a lot about this. It's very, very complicated. But I'm not sure really what you want us to do differently, other than just kind of move forward, because there's so many pieces that do conflict. I agree with you.
Okay, so what I'm trying to really get at here is how, if the airport is leasing land that they don't own to the county, how could you say that clears up the problem?
So the airport is giving whatever rights they have, they're giving to us in some type of lease. So they're out of it.
So if they have
So we can control it.
on his property also, they could.
And we talked about moving that towards clearing up the cloud on his property. We don't want to be, we want to move, that's the goal.
Well,
So the interim documents, the interim steps in process,
If they still own it, I don't see how that clears it up.
well, that ultimately they're not going to own it. That's the intent. That's what they've agreed to.
So in the gray area of if there is a lease period or, like, can you build in any protections or add provisions that would exclude them from having any sort of claim on people's property? Like, have those pink sections be protected in any real or material way in order to help allay the fears of the people who live in that section that, and another thing is that it is such a complicated situation, and Francis has this map. I don't know how many maps that everybody has that you're working with, and it's just such a kerfuffle. If you put this map up there, you should also be putting all of the other maps up that you're working with. It's, that might help to illustrate just part of the complexity of your position in trying to ascertain what would hold water in court, because that sounds like a significant point of bone of contention is what would the county be able to stand with certainty in a court of law, and how would they be able to protect their rights or our rights as property owners? So,
But again, that ultimately is going to be decided by the State Lands Commission. In the interim, though, the point of the lease arrangement is to clear it up for the homeowners, right, Craig?
so can you allow any additional protection to the homeowners in that lease period prior to if the MOU gets adopted?
No, I think there's probably, the language could be tweaked a little bit, so anybody that has suggested tweaks to that section, that would be great. I mean, definitely the intent is to do just what you described, is to remove these clouds for the property owners and not have us involved or the airport involved.
Okay, so we're now at 2 hours. I know folks are busy. We've got some new speakers, which is great. Why don't we think about 10, 15 more minutes max? Does that sound right? Okay. Make it good.
A quick
Make
question.
it
I'm going to
good.
try to make it good. It's like, okay, my understanding of a lease is the person underneath that owns the property is leasing it to you, so they still own it, correct? Like if the airport's leasing you the property, they still own it.
No, it's the county's leasing the airport the property.
There are two different leases.
Right.
So the owner is still the person leasing anyway, but is there a way to do it, like she's saying, can we do the quick claim ahead of time? Can we just, if they're willing to give up that property, based on the state lands, if we could quit claim those properties rather than do a lease, that might be even more wonderful?
Yeah, I think that's worth looking at some revised language and seeing if they're willing. But that's the goal, and whatever has to come first.
So if we're waiting for state lands and $300,000 and 10 years later.
Yeah, so that's an option. So if somebody, give me written comments by that period, and there's some revised language, that'd be great.
Yes.
Before you go on to another subject. So, as many of us know already, the only reason why they claim to own the property where people's boat docks are was to silence critics of them. And the fact that they've already got the sports complex now, they don't need to silence, they don't have no interest in those boat docks anyway, other than to do that. So this is the time to include in this agreement what we've just suggested here, in my opinion, and that is to tell them to relinquish that side of the creek right now as part of this agreement.
Okay, good suggestion.
So the one thing I hear that is clear so far in this discussion is that the lands and the ownership of the lands is unclear. And there have been a lot of fair points brought up on both sides of this agreement that's being proposed. But there are also a lot of what-if statements going on depending on the ownership of the land. So my recommendation would be that you figure out who owns the land before you make these choices. And if you don't know who owns the land, which is what I think is happening, how would you go about figuring out the ownership?
So built into the agreement is a process to go before the State Lands Commission and have them decide the boundaries.
All right.
I could add a little bit to that too. So there's a process in case law called a boundary agreement. And so a lot of times there are boundaries that are really unclear. And so what happens is both parties agree, this is where the boundary is going to be, and then they grant whatever rights they have just to clean it all up. We're finally just going to agree it's going to be right here. Because you could spend a lot of time with conflicting information and never really get anywhere. So if we can all agree where the line's going to be, then we clean it all up with some legal documents. That's kind of the process.
So I agree, and I think that's a very important part of this process, but I believe that it should be cleared up before you go about leasing the lands to each other, because for me it sounds like this, based on what's been discussed, the state's land commission is going to take a while to determine and settle this, but the lease is going to happen in the interim before this is settled. So before you go about leasing land to each other, we should determine who owned the land first.
Again, though, the point, the lease or whatever we decide, and we've gotten some feedback tonight, is just a vehicle to achieve the purposes of the other purposes of the agreement, which are to assign responsibility for who's maintaining and repairing the levees, right? I mean, we don't want to wait that long on that, ideally, as well as, homeowners do have uncertainty now, so that's the trade-off.
I just wanted to say that I think the MOU is potentially a vehicle to clear the discrepancies about boundary, title, and land use up in the South Fork of Gleanis Creek, which is very valuable to all the land and resource managers, public and private property owners. So I think it's a good thing to pursue. That said, I think in the development of this MOU map, it does not in any way represent any other private property interest except that of the airport, and therefore the map is not, doesn't equally represent all private property owners in the corridor being evaluated. And so that, as a starting point, is something that is inherently going to make for other private property members whose property is not well delineated on that map very uncomfortable. And then the second question, I think, goes to the issue of the maintenance of the levee and the responsibilities for that maintenance. Many members of the Watershed Council have for years expressed concern about the lack of environmental stewardship in the maintenance of the levees, the fact that there is no consultation with respect to special status species or the Endangered Species Act with regard to the maintenance of the levees, and that maintenance of the levees is ongoing maintenance as emergency measures is not appropriate. Then the third comment that I have with regard to the levees and EIR is that the levees were excluded from the airport's EIR. And so I know that the county is doing a wonderful job looking at shoreline adaptation and sea level rise issues. It's clear that the county has estimates of where levees need to be on a 50-year design for this project. And it's not clear how those levees will be improved over the life of the project or for the airport now and in the future. So if the county is going to go forward with that stewardship, I think it's very important that they make sure that the property owner understand what their obligations are for improvement of the levee and what is required for the safety of anyone publicly using that property recreationally.
Good comments.
So I just want everybody to understand one thing here. It's extremely important to see how Damon has tackled this extremely complex subject. First guy to try this in, I don't know, forever. And so I want to thank him, and I want you all to think long and hard about how he's been doing this for the community. Having said that, I think we've heard 2 hours worth of questions. We're all tired, need to go home. where do we go from here? When, I believe you said the comment period is in January, is going to end in January? So,
December 11th.
oh, December? Okay. So what are the next steps? And then, you know, the voices that will be heard after tonight, how will they be heard and how will the community be informed?
And who's, will you define community? Will it be the whole watershed or just this little surrounding of the airport property?
Yeah, no, it's broader than that. We've tried to get the word out, and please do so as well, to, at a minimum, all of Santa Venetia, and reflective of the crowd tonight, I think the word's getting out even beyond that. There's a lot of interest in it.
Can people subscribe online to notifications about this issue?
Great question. Craig?
Yeah, so next steps, just to reiterate that, so we're looking for written comments by December 11th, and then based on the nature of the comments, if they're kind of minor, like some of the ones that were suggested, tweak the language a little bit here, those will go pretty quick. If they're voluminous, then it's going to take us a while to go through it. So we don't really have a date set when the board would hear it. So to announce this meeting, we sent it out to the entire email list for CSA 6 and Flood Control Zone 7 and posted it on Nextdoor. So, and we gave it to, I think you worked with GFCA to put it through there.
Yeah,
I mean, not SVNA, I mean. Yeah, no, and so we plan to do the same. If somebody thinks that there's something else we should be doing to notify people, we'd be glad to do that.
Can we sign up online? As a conservation organization, can we sign up online to receive notices about things like this?
Yeah, anybody can be a member of CSA 6 or Flood Control Zone 7's email list. So that's easy to do.
So is there I'm sorry, I haven't gone to the county's website, but there are oftentimes specific issues that you can subscribe to, any notifications or alerts? Do you know if there's anything set up in order to do that?
No,
with this issue?
at this point, we've just noticed those two email lists.
Okay, so I see one more hand. It's got to be new, and maybe keep it short, because you will have an opportunity to submit comments in writing, which would be greatly appreciated. We're going to make these the last two comments, and we're then going to wrap it up.
I think there's no question that everybody in this room would like to clear up the boundary issues, and I think it's a good start. But I think that the MOU is too vague to accomplish this. I like the idea of getting a quitclaim for the properties beforehand, because once you get the lease, there's no guarantee that State Lands is going to follow through with all the surveys and everything to make the land swap possible. And the expense of it is going to be tremendous. I don't know where that money is going to come from. And so I don't even know if that's even worth it. So, but I think if you can get a quitclaim and go that route, that'd be great.
Who does pay for the State Lands survey?
We are under the agreement, and we think that would be about $300,000.
That would be cheap.
I have a suggestion. I've heard a lot of concern about the issue, including the issue I brought up about, who owns the property that the airport claims that it owns. And I have not I've heard that we just want to clear the cloud up, but that doesn't tell the public anything. I think perhaps that the county might consider posting on its website all documents related to land ownership in all its records, and post it on the website regarding property ownership of that land that the airport is proposing to swap to the county. And that might, people, in the name of transparency, people can go through those records, take a look for themselves, and then there'd be more certainty before the MOU is signed and well before you submit it to State Lands. Thanks.
I don't have any problem with giving those documents, but Francis sent me another one. I'll give you an example. Just so you know that you will not learn much from looking at these old documents. They're very hard to understand.
You need to have a narrative. You know exactly, this county knows exactly why that's like
So here's the map of Santa Venetia Company from 1913. Knowing where your home is and where the levees are, you need to have a professional surveyor actually interpret this for you. It's very difficult.
Is that it has the state 1870 Allard survey on there, and that's the one that the airport is, that's the one the airport parcel is using, that has the 1907 Richardson survey, which is the one that the county used to develop all the subdivisions. The county knew that there was a problem with the Allard line, that the state, the county allowed the creek to be dredged, so then the state wouldn't, because they didn't have the state approved the new survey.
So the point I was just trying to make is that until you had a surveyor go tell you where these lines are on the ground, you will not be able to interpret that much. But I don't have a problem with the documents.
You could put a narrative up there of what happened.
That's a public records act request. All your records, whether you think they're helpful or not.
No, I said I have no problem with it. I just was trying to lower the expectations that somebody's going to get this and be able to understand it. They all conflict. The goal is to identify clean boundaries and ignore all this history in the end and not have somebody having to go through 150 years worth of documents to figure out where the lines are. So I think that was it. I want to say thanks to everybody for coming. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. So we'll thank you very much for your feedback, and we'll for sure be in touch.